Now to tonight's speaker. He invited himself in one way, in that he sent me a copy of his new book, which is for sale after the talk. He'd been one of David Jeffries' first, now what level was it? Second year university in Victoria, that was, and then followed him here and became a member of the English department in Ottawa, and then went off to become a professor of English literature in the University of British Columbia, and survived the experience, which is an amazing thing to be able to say. But I loved the book, and it happened that I was going to BC, so I said, can I come and visit? And we visited, and we had an enjoyable lunch, and then I persuaded him to come and do the Weston lecture this year. He belongs to a generation it's going to be hard to imagine. I mean, he's published in the Scientific American. He's written a book on Milton. He's written another on Rheticus, and he speaks several languages. He's got a real interest in astronomy, such that he'll be off to Poland shortly for some sort of Copernican, I can't say reunion because it's rather a long while, but celebration. You don't find people in English departments that do that kind of thing very often. And of course, it's going to be almost impossible in the future because the university has turned into a machine for extracting short-term memory. And so you don't build a mind over time with stuff that's of permanent significance, which is essential. And languages, they're disappearing. Classics departments are disappearing all over the world. When I went to school, when Sally went to school, Latin was part of our career. What it did to us, we're not quite sure, but it certainly made a different sort of generation to the one we've got now. Now, I heard the pleasure of listening to Dennis last night, talking about Copernicus. You're not going to get that today. But the abolition of man, you clearly recognize the ongoing abolition of man, its origin with C.S. Lewis. And I'm not going to waste any more time, and we can get to the real content of the evening. Dennis, please.
Thank you so much for that introduction, John, and for the privilege of being here tonight. As John mentioned, I began my academic career at the University of Ottawa. I was delighted when I arrived at the University of Ottawa to discover its motto. This morning with the students of Augustine College, we were exercising a bit of Latin. And do any of you students know what the motto of the University of Ottawa, I hope is, certainly was?
Deus scientiarum Dominus est.
Excellent. Dominus scientiarum Dominus est. God is, there are different ways of translating it, but the one I used was God is Lord of the scientiarum, of the branches of knowledge, from which we get our word science. So that was kind of a thrill for me, almost 40 years ago. And so this is a bit of a homecoming for me. Our second daughter was born in Ottawa, at home in the glebe. She now lives across the river. I've seen so many, I hesitate to use the adjective old, but old friends tonight from the West Coast and from elsewhere, even when I babysat once. So it's a real privilege to be here. Now here's the background about the little book whose cover image you see on the screen, and to which today's talk is closely related. Just over 75 years ago, in 1943, amid the dark war years in Britain, a scholar named C.S. Lewis gave 3 lectures that he then turned into a little book called The Abolition of Man. Its 3 chapters were titled respectively Men Without Chests, The Way, and The Abolition of Man. The 3rd chapter gave the book as a whole its title. The subtitle was Reflections on Education, with special reference to the teaching of English in the upper forms of school. In those days, they didn't bother much about snappy subtitles. And I always like to point out that C.S. Lewis was by trade an English professor. Many know him as the author of the Narnia Tales. He was also a medieval and Renaissance scholar, and one of the 20th century's greatest Christian apologists. John has already introduced the concept of apologetics tonight. For those of you who don't know, it's not the sort of habitual Canadian habit of apologizing for everything, but apologetics in the sense of setting forth reasons for the faith. In The Abolition of Man, however, Lewis mentions only once, and in passing, that he's a Christian. Yet despite this work's lack of openly theological language, it has been ranked by some, including Lewis himself, as among his most significant achievements. Of course, one of the advantages of that book and of my remake of it, which I'll talk about in a second, is that it's short. And what's nicer than a short book? A friend of mine at Regent College read it. He had to fly from Vancouver to Halifax, and he read the whole thing on his flights east. C.S. Lewis's book offers a compact argument against what he calls moral subjectivism. And today the more common and slightly broader term is moral relativism. Lewis argues that genuine humanity is threatened by such relativism, and therefore that opposing it must be part of the duty of a true education. Well, all that being said and acknowledged, why didn't I, in light of the importance of that message, simply go on a mission to get people to read Lewis's original book, instead of being so uppity as to attempt my own version of it? Well, actually, I did do this. In the autumn of 1977, before most of you were born, when I taught my first ever university course at Stanford, The Abolition of Man was the first book I assigned. I just wanted students to read it. We weren't even going to discuss it. I got them to write a précis of the first chapter. Writing a précis was the first exercise in the old freshman English, as we called it then. And to my surprise, the students took to the book. And one eager student, these were the days before Amazon.com, asked me where he could buy another copy to give to his mother for Christmas. But that was almost 42 years ago. And remember that the subtitle of Lewis's book was Reflections on Education with special reference to the teaching of English in the upper forms of school. Well, I'm guessing that many in North America today wouldn't have any idea what the upper forms of school are, so that might be a bit off-putting just by itself. So about 3 years ago, I latched onto the idea of what in the movie business is called a remake. You're all familiar with this phenomenon. You know, like the Magnificent Seven from the Seven Samurai, and there are many, many examples of this. And sometimes the remake is a lame imitation. Sometimes it's simply an updating of an older story. By the way, I was going to show you. There it is. There's Lewis's Abolition of Man, first edition. And by the way, if you owned that copy, your net worth would be greater than if you just buy a copy of my book afterward. When I started this little project, I decided that I would quite slavishly follow Lewis paragraph by paragraph, and that got me through about the first of the 3 chapters. And then in the second chapter, I started to spread my wings a little bit. And by the third chapter, those of you who've written books know that books can develop their own momentum. It almost feels like a separate agent who's carrying you along, and that's how I felt with this book. I got deeper and deeper into examples from the present day of the corrosive moral relativism that Lewis was arguing against. So I think if you read Lewis and me back to back, you'll see a family resemblance, But I hope at least that you'll also see that my book is more than just a clone, even though we're working on the same side of a massively significant argument. What I offer, to put it most simply, is a case for moral realism. And in doing so, I employ both in my text and in my title a useful piece of vocabulary borrowed from The Abolition of Man. And it serves as shorthand for the transcultural, or perhaps supracultural, fund or reservoir of teachings that is the source of moral judgment, of codes of ethics, and of standards of right and wrong. The word bespeaks something universal. And while it's obviously derived from Chinese and from Chinese philosophy and religion, be it Taoist or Confucianism, the term is in its borrowed form isn't intended to evoke Taoism or Confucianism. And by the way, in proper official Chinese pinyin spelling, it should be Tao with a D. But there are so many books in English that begin the Tao with a T, the Tao of Winnie the Pooh, the Tao of physics, and so on, that I felt I wanted to stay in that tradition. So that's an Anglophone tradition rather than a Sinophone tradition. So let me try to bring out into the open the position I'm suggesting that we need to oppose. Lewis called it subjectivism. More broadly, it's relativism. And even more broadly, at a philosophical level, it's naturalism. I'm not trying to multiply the vocabulary, but naturalism is the sort of philosophically credentialed term that's often used. And we need to bring that into the open, not only because these things continue to be powerful, but also because they're so powerful that sometimes we don't even notice that they're there, like the air that we breathe. This is a dominant philosophy, and believe me, it is a philosophy of sorts. So let me illustrate with reference to two recent bestsellers. In 2016, the Caltech physicist Sean Carroll published a much acclaimed volume titled The Big Picture on the Origins of Life, Meaning, and the Universe Itself. Now, I've never shied from overly ambitious titles. I like big picture things. So I picked up this book and read it, and I thought, this is a lovely example of exactly the sort of thing that needs to be opposed. In this book, Carroll declares that meaning, morality, and purpose aren't built into the architecture of the universe. They emerge as ways of talking about our human-scale environment. Science couldn't care less about how we ought to behave because the source of these values isn't the outside world, it's inside us. Sean Carroll rejects what he calls our folk ontology, according to which meaning might be given by God, or inherent in life's spiritual dimension, or part of a teleological inclination built into the universe itself, or part of an ineffable, transcendent aspect of reality. In place of such myth-making, Carroll promotes what he calls poetic naturalism. By the way, you'll notice my irritation here because as a scientist, he's trying to dress up this life-destroying philosophy with terms borrowed from my discipline, right? Carroll promotes what he calls poetic naturalism, which rejects all those possibilities and asks us to take the dramatic step of viewing meaning in the same way we view other concepts that human beings invent to talk about the universe. So in spite of dressing up his bleak doctrine with words like poetic and dramatic, as well as, of course, scientific, Carroll offers conclusions that follow ineluctably not from empirical evidence, but from a fervently held and asserted naturalism. And again, by naturalism, I refer not to literary or artistic style, sometimes used in that way, and definitely not to the practice of those who prefer to go about without any clothes on, naturalists in that sense. I'm speaking rather of philosophical naturalism, the position dedicated to excluding anything supernatural or transcendent in one's explanations and committed to focusing exclusively on natural properties and causes. The patterns of thought we see in Carroll, the patterns are familiar and they are familiar and unrelenting ones that emerge whenever a hardcore naturalist tackles questions concerning meaning, morals, and purpose. Back in 1977, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg wrote, near the end of his famous book on the origins of the universe, the first 3 minutes, some of you may have heard of that book, that the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But of course, it's not surprising that a rigorously physics-based study of the cosmos might end with the conclusion that there's nothing behind or beyond or above or beyond it. That is just how methodological naturalism proceeds. And so the innocent-looking naturalism present at the start of the argument emerges at the end as a thoroughgoing philosophical naturalism. And when it comes to deep, by the way, in doing PowerPoint, I often give people a blank screen to look at just so that they're focusing their minds on language and logic and things like that, so that it's not just more television. When it comes to deep meaning and principles of right and wrong, philosophical naturalism demands a search for something social, psychological, biological, physical, etc., that underlies them. In other words, it treats moral principles not truly as principles. You know, again, in my pedantic way, I insist that principles are things that by definition come first. Just as in principio, right, you guys? In the beginning. Things that are foundational, that do indeed stand behind or beyond or above or below the contingencies of human behavior, and that guide the decisions and judgments we make concerning those things. Naturalism, by contrast, drives us to explain morality, virtue, standards of right and wrong, shoulds and goods, in terms of something it imagines or assumes is even more basic, by which it means more physical, more natural. And as many of you know, physis is the Greek word for nature, from which we get physics. But such assertions of naturalism are not restricted to physicists. Another best-selling book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, another big, ambitious title, by historian Yuval Noah Harari, offers a similarly reductionist and naturalistic account of all things human. Harari comments, for example, on the United States Declaration of Independence. And I know from getting to know students this morning that some of you are from south of the border, so you know this document better than we Canucks. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And Harari sniffs and says, just as people were never created, neither according to the science of biology is there a creator who endows them with anything. There is only a blind evolutionary process devoid of any purpose. Moreover, according to Harari's sweeping history, what does give us humans a sense of meaning and of purpose and sustains the social order are a series of mere inventions. He calls them imagined constructs, myths and fictions, and a network of artificial instincts called culture. Harari wields his naturalism to attack not only religion, but also the very idea of human rights and the belief, quote, that every individual has a sacred inner nature, indivisible and immutable, which gives meaning to the world and which is the source of all ethical and political authority. Harari views such tenets as a mere reincarnation of the traditional Christian belief in a free and eternal soul, a belief that he treats as thoroughly undermined. Why? Because scientists, and I'm quoting him, studying the inner workings of the human organism, have found no soul there. In short, as one reviewer of Harari's book comments, this is John Sexton in The New Atlantis, central to Harari's argument is a total eclipse of the human person. Total eclipse of the human person. This rather nicely recasts Lewis's phrase, abolition of man. In the absence of strong moral realism, we are left with effectively only one option, a moral nihilism that evacuates all transcendent meaning and purpose from the world and from our species. And in particular, today's social sciences almost uniformly treat morality as relative either to nature, instinct, biology, evolutionary psychology, and so on, or to culture or society naturalistically conceived. The problem here is that the more thoroughly the naturalistic social sciences explain such parts or manifestations of nature, the more these, like Weinberg's universe, end up appearing pointless. For if value, purpose, and a substantial ought are banished from your premises and assumptions, then inevitably those things are also absent from your conclusions about life, humanity, the world, and likewise inevitably absent from the education you offer in your schools and universities. Well, someone might, of course, reply, so much the worse for moral realism. Too bad for Lewis's Tao. It's not supported by science. But of course, this lack of scientific support arises from premises, from assumptions that are methodologically naturalistic. It is not something that legitimately emerges from evidence plus a careful chain of reasoning. It is not itself a scientific or empirical conclusion. Or if it's a conclusion at all, it is so in a very watered-down sense, one following from presuppositions that guarantees an absence of moral purpose in the so-called findings of any science guided exclusively by those presuppositions. Well, there's a particular principle relevant to the debate about moral realism or its denial that needs to be asserted. And the students with whom I had a delightful time conversing this morning know that I'm very fond of pleonasms, tautologies, things that almost look completely obvious. And this is one of them. Once you understand the meaning of the words, it's sort of true by definition. It's sufficiently ample to be plenty adequate enough. That's one of my favorites. Mutual repugnance cuts both ways. Especially for those of you who haven't yet taken a course in basic logic. Forgive me if in my pedantic way I introduce a few useful logical principles. Consider this matched pair of logic's most basic axioms. Some people just zone out when they see any symbolic expressions. So please just bear with me. This won't last terribly long and it'll be relatively painless. The two principles of logic that I'm talking about are known respectively as modus ponens and modus tollens. Modus ponens is the method of positing. Modus tollens is the method of taking away. Okay, so P implies Q. This is an example of modus ponens. P implies Q. P is true, therefore Q is true. P and Q are symbolic of propositions. So if P implies Q and P is true, then Q is true. And the symbols underneath just say the same thing in symbolic notation. P implies Q, P, therefore Q. And modus tollens, P implies Q, Q is not true, therefore P is not Q. So P implies, again, the symbols beneath that say the same thing. So just a quick example. X is a horse implies X has hooves. X is a horse, proposition 2, therefore X has hooves, modus ponens. That's a logical statement. Modus tollens takes the statement, X is a horse, implies that X has hooves, but X does not have hooves. Therefore, X is not a horse. See how the mutual repugnance cuts both ways. So you can go frontwards and backwards through this set of implications. Well, I love this sort of thing. Some people are a bit bewildered by it, but this is good basic logic 101. However, when it comes to matters of morality and other things that give meaning to our lives, today's proponents of reductionist naturalism display a remarkable blindness to the latter half of this pair of axioms. Clearly, if P is the set of naturalistic assumptions, and if these entail Q, a denial of substantial meaning, morality, purpose, and so on, and if P is correct and reliable, then the denial of substantial meaning, morality, purpose, and so on is also correct and reliable. Thus we can conclude, too bad for the Tao, too bad for moral realism. Now this is the core of my argument, and it's so important that I want to go over it once more so it has a chance to settle into your consciousness. If P is the set of naturalistic assumptions, and if these entail Q, a denial of substantial meaning, morality, purpose, and so on, and if P is correct and reliable, if those naturalistic assumptions are reliable, then the denial of substantial meaning, morality, purpose, and so on is also correct and reliable. And Carroll is right, and Harari is right, and we can conclude, too bad for the Tao, too bad for moral realism. But don't forget, mutual repugnance cuts both ways. It's only fair to remind the reductionists of modus tollens, whereby the logic of their own position might work against them. For if naturalistic science cannot discern or explain purpose in the world, or in our collective or individual lives, then that inability in turn implies, too bad for naturalism. You and I and everybody else, including physicists, historians, and anthropologists, do, as a matter of fact, have aims and goals. The very fabric of our lives is teleological, purpose-driven, in ways that far transcend the dissemination of our genes, even if that's part of it, as was suggested by John in his introduction tonight. Therefore, a failure to account for that strong sense and experience of purpose, of goal-directedness, of moral worthwhileness is a serious failure indeed. It points decisively to a limitation of science as naturalistically conceived and practiced. It offers a not Q that undermines the truth or sufficiency of the reductionist's set of assumptions, P. This observation is, of course, in no way an attack upon science or scientists, nor any kind of devaluation of science or scientists' amazing achievements. It is simply a sober acknowledgement of the existence of truths and domains that, for science as naturalistically practiced, fall outside its sole jurisdiction. To echo Shakespeare's Hamlet, there are more things in heaven and earth than are encompassed by the empirical method. And this observation does, of course, imply a critique of what is sometimes called scientism. Essentially, the assertion or assumption, not itself a scientific conclusion, that the scientific method is the adequate and all-encompassing and sole arbiter of truth and human knowledge. But to warn against such overreaching is not to take a position hostile to genuine science, nor towards its practitioners and their achievements. Of course, some scientists, if not many, and I'm talking now about social scientists, some social scientists acknowledge the limitations and insufficiency of naturalistic assumptions, even though they are their stock in trade. Just quick examples. Yale sociologist Philip Gorski has asserted, quote, "We can't be complete relativists in our everyday lives. There is no escaping ethical life." John was telling me over supper that the first moral utterance you hear from children is, "It's not fair." They know. It's something we can't not know. And anthropologist Carolyn Flew-Loban, rejecting the relativist reflex, as she calls it, to almost any challenge to cultural practice on moral or philosophical grounds, female mutilation, for example, or the honor killing of women. Any sociologist who studies that at some level has to conclude that in the end, moral judgment and human rights take precedence and choices have to be made. In short, not Q implies not P. Probably the most influential biologist of all time, apart from Charles Darwin himself, evolutionary biologist, was T.H. Huxley, popularly known as Darwin's bulldog. Huxley, in matters pertaining to religion, was an avowed agnostic, a term which he himself coined. Nonetheless, Huxley saw very clearly the insufficiency of naturalistic evolution alone as a foundation of morals. He gave a lecture late in his career called Evolution and Ethics. And in this lecture, Huxley reviews various characteristics he sees as accounting for humankind's, quote, success in the struggle for existence. Self-assertion, the unscrupulous seizing upon all that can be grasped, the tenacious holding of all that can be kept. In short, qualities which humankind shares with the ape and the tiger. Cunning, sociability, curiosity, as well as ruthless and ferocious destructiveness. However, in what Huxley sees as our now more advanced state, he says, civilized man brands all these ape and tiger promptings with the name of sins. And there is a general consensus that the ape and tiger methods of the struggle for existence are not reconcilable with sound ethical principles. The contrast between the workings of biology and the norms of human ethics appears starkly in specific cases within the animal kingdom. The journal Science recently reported on research conducted with these fellows. I'm using the term generically. males and females, not just males. These are geladas. And you can, if you're interested in this, you can follow all this as you can everything else in the world on YouTube. Geladas are large baboon-like monkeys inhabiting the mountains of Ethiopia, and they offer a case in point. They live in units of a single dominant male and up to a dozen females. But bachelor groups threaten and sometimes oust the dominant male. And when this happens, a new dominant male gains reproductive access to the group's females and kills perhaps half of all his predecessor's offspring, while, and this is the interesting thing about the science article, 80% of female geladas pregnant at the time spontaneously abort the fetuses they are carrying. So there's a similar male practice of infanticide that occurs among African lions. And whether it's among geladas or lions or another species, such infanticide serves not only to diminish the genetic legacy of the newly dominant male's predecessor, the previous alpha male, but also to accelerate the fertility of the females, which cease to lactate and thus resume ovulation, so that the new infanticidal alpha male can establish his genetic legacy as quickly as possible. Now, those hoping to infer principles of morality naturalistically often appeal to positive behaviors. Now, I won't say how they know that they're positive behaviors, because if they're just naturalists, they don't have a criterion for deciding what are positive behaviors. Anyway, be that as it may, they appeal to more positive behaviors, such as altruism, that appear in various animal species. However, more shocking behaviors, such as lions and geladas' infanticide, make such inferences problematic. Do we look to some still higher instinct that will help us adjudicate which lower instincts to obey? Altruism or infanticide, or perhaps which behaviors humans themselves should emulate? And the point is not that animal behaviors have no relevance to our understanding of human behavior, but rather that we require a standard of judgment above and beyond, or perhaps beneath, and broader than that offered by bare biology, as a guide to what is morally permissible and advantageous, or obligatory. We do, after all, need something like Carroll's quickly dismissed folk ontology with its ineffable transcendent. Now, zoologists don't, of course, either approve or disapprove of infanticide among geladas or lions. In the words of the common cliche, it is what it is. But when we turn our attention to human behavior, we do express approval or disapproval, satisfaction or disappointment, affirmative or negative judgment. Huxley sees this response as involving something of a paradox, given his convictions about human origins, out of what he calls the cosmic process. At some point in this process, the conscience of man, he says, revolted against the moral indifference of nature. Thus, there is a sharp clash between the is of nature and the ought that we apply to human beings. And given such a clash, it again seems futile to regard that ought as something merely arising from the empirical is. For as Huxley observes, cosmic nature is no school of virtue. There's a recognition that there's something more required. Frustrated as he is by the apparent gulf between nature's is and moral reality's ought, at least Huxley doesn't dogmatically seek to reduce the latter to the former. For he acknowledges evolution alone is incompetent to furnish any adequate reason why what we call good is preferable to what we call evil. So, although Huxley may not be an obvious pick for one's top 10 list of moral realists. He certainly offers another glimpse of the moral not Q that implies a further too bad for purely naturalistic science. Again, this is no critique of science as such. The inability of naturalistic science to account for the goods and shoulds of human moral life might instead be treated less as a failure than as a blameless omission, a mere innocent incapacity to achieve something that was never part of its competence or job description in the first place. And I guess this would be my basic position here. Again, it's not an anti-science position. It's simply saying that methodological naturalism isn't the whole game, certainly not the only game in town. But an acceptance of this account only solves part of our problem. We may hear the silence of science concerning ultimate moral foundations, though it has much to teach us about the how-to of practical moral behavior, and then rush to the conclusion that goods and shoulds, statements about virtues and values, must merely be non-factual matters of opinion, and that disputes about moral right and wrong are unresolvable because each of us in each of our respective cultures simply view the world differently from one another. Of course, it's not empirical science itself that's to blame for this apparent vacuum within our social and educational philosophy. Instead, what's at fault, I think, is the assumption that if empirical science doesn't produce reliable knowledge, nothing else can. One critical facet of Lewis's Abolition of Man was the recognition of the role that naturalistic and subjectivist assumptions play in curricular materials used in schools, absorbed by students who are not yet even at the level of university or college, and thus not even at the stage in life where any of them is aware that anything is being debated. Nor has the battle over this terrain ceased in 75 years. It's got worse. For the sake of our communities, our democracy, our human future, we need to keep asking and demanding what kinds of morals, what notions of right and wrong our schools instill in our children, often at a very early age, and what kinds of reasons are the young given for being virtuous people and good citizens. If we examine standard curricula mandated by governments and school boards around the English-speaking world, the picture that emerges is a very discouraging one. Today, dominant assumptions and de facto orthodoxies about morality are thoroughly relativistic. Judgments about right and wrong, standard curricula suggest, are determined merely by our biology or by our culture, and of course there are many cultures, or by our individual or collective emotions or subjectivities, or by some combination of these things. The key phrase here is determined merely by. And nobody should be so foolhardy as to argue that biology or culture or emotions are irrelevant to our moral judgments. The problem arises when we treat these things either one by one or in combination as exhaustive determinants of right and wrong. In this regard, a common fallacy is to recognize that we humans are powerfully shaped by nature and nurture, but then to slip into the presumption that morality, judgments or claims concerning right and wrong, can't be connected with or rooted in anything transcending nature and nurture. So at a practical level, what are our children actually taught in school? Most of you, certainly those of you who are parents, can probably give more up-to-date examples than I can. I doubt that most educators deliberately aim to teach their students that statements expressing moral judgments are unimportant. Yet many standard, currently required materials support that inference. A crucial item among such materials sounds at first innocent enough. For example, the official curriculum of my home and native province of British Columbia, titled Building Student Success, has a section on competencies to be acquired in English language arts, in this case taught to 11 and 12-year-olds. The document mandates, quote, that students should be prompted to distinguish fact from opinion. Similar language appears in the Common Core curriculum currently adopted for use in schools in over 40 states in the U.S. In History, Social Studies 6 to 12, the reading standards for literacy in that curriculum state that students must acquire an ability to distinguish among fact, opinion, and reasoned judgment in a text. Well, come on, how could we object to anything that sounds so reasonable? But if you drill down into this curriculum and look at the actual teaching materials used, as I have done to a certain extent, definitions, worksheets with separate columns for facts and opinions, instructional videos and the like, that accompany the Common Core and other curricula like it, you'll find examples like these. Some are more egregious than others. A standard definition of fact, according to such curricula, is that it is a statement that can be proven. But this criterion can convey a dangerously false sense of how easy it is to establish what is factual. Whether in history or law or science, some of human beings' greatest intellectual challenges, and some of them extending over years, even centuries, have involved attempts to discern and to prove what is truly the case. For example, as the Augustine college students know from my morning talk, this is a case dear to my heart. Copernicus claimed that the earth revolves around the sun rather than the other way around. But that claim, that the sun is in the center of what we call the solar system rather than the earth being there, took a good 150 years to establish on a scientific basis. It wasn't just benighted traditionalists fighting rearguard action against the brilliant, forward-looking scientists. It was no straightforward matter of marshalling scientific fact against mere opinion. To suggest that things we call facts don't entail controversy or require interpretation is seriously misleading. Current lessons about facts as taught by the Common Core and elsewhere appear even more uninformed and incoherent when we consider that our everyday usage emerged barely 300 years ago, as David Wooten, the historian, has recently illustrated in his book called The Invention of Science. And again, speaking to the students who are studying Latin, fact originally meant something that was factus, facere, the verb to do. It was something that was done by somebody. It still survives in our usage. He was an accessory after the fact in criminal law. Right? After the fact means after the deed, after the thing that was done. It's not just a sort of disembodied truth. And what about the definition of opinion? Distinguished from facts, again in these curricula, opinions are most obviously statements that can't be proven. Students are taught to watch out for certain vocabulary that characterizes such statements. Words like good, bad, and should. Most opinions cited in materials linked with the Common Core appear uncontroversial, if stunningly banal. Repeated examples include, dogs make better pets than cats, and chocolate ice cream tastes better than vanilla. Much more disturbing, however, is the way that judgments about value or morals are also mixed in with preferences of ice cream flavors and defined as opinions, and by suggestion merely as opinions. One set of exercises offering a paragraph about the ancient constitution of the construction of the pyramids at Giza in Egypt asks students to classify statements as fact, opinion, or fact and opinion. One sentence reads, to build the pyramids, thousands of laborers worked under unfair, brutal conditions. the indicated correct response is that the statement is a combination of fact and opinion, with presumably the large number of laborers being factual, because, of course, if you were there, you could count them, and their unfair, brutal conditions being merely a matter of opinion. I suspect a sociologist back then who took a poll would find that it was a unanimous opinion. Maybe that would make it a fact. But today's students are taught when they're studying history that the really important thing to look for is the facts. And most corrosive, I think, is the confusion that the simplistic and philosophically shallow binary classification of fact and opinion entails for moral judgment. By which I don't mean moralistic judgmentalism. We're very afraid of moralism and judgmentalism. But rather, what it entails for the kind of judgment that you express and that I express with conviction when you declare that Mary is a good person, or that it's wrong to injure an opposing player so that your team can win a game. In the teaching materials of the Common Core, statements such as copying homework assignments is wrong and all men are created equal are relegated to the domain of mere opinion. And claims of right and wrong are placed in the level of subjective preferences for one flavor of ice cream over another. Students may officially be studying English or history, but the lesson they absorb is that right and wrong are subjective, and that statements about such matters are, personal. Just like assertions that dogs make better pets than cats. Notice I did not say consciously absorb. Perhaps the greatest danger of the kinds of teaching illustrated here is that its recipients are, many of them, 11 or 12-year-olds, not young adults even, children who think they're being taught English language arts or history and social studies without any awareness, as Lewis wrote 3/4 of a century ago, that ethics, theology, and politics are all at stake. What's being put into students' minds is not a theory, and I'm quoting Lewis here, but an assumption that in 10 years will condition them to take one side of a controversy they have never recognized as a controversy at all. I think if educators themselves truly accepted the relegation of shoulds and oughts and judgments about what is important to the status of uncertain and unprovable statements of attitude or opinion, then there would be no point in our trying to convince them of the bad effects of the kind of teaching materials I've mentioned. For that conclusion would itself be a value judgment, words like good, bad, and important, of course, marking any such claim as mere opinion. The glaring contradictions, however, between our schools' curricula and their own statements of purpose, learning principles, and codes of conduct might raise the suspicion that today's educators don't actually believe, and at least some of them don't put into practice, the fact versus opinion materials they're required to teach. I hope they don't. And I'm certainly prepared to believe that most educators are better than the pallid principles, in scare quotes, embedded in our schools' curricula. But we dare not underestimate the effect over time of positions such as those implied in the dogmatic naturalists' versions of science and history, and in the superficial versions of the same dogmas that show up in places like the Common Core. At very least, these are bound to vitiate educators' own capacity to affirm, uphold, and impart moral principles. Principles whose denial is inevitably toxic to authentic human flourishing and our earthly future. Efforts to thwart the spread of such poison must involve a bold assertion of the not Q, of both a philosophical and a lived moral realism that will not relent in its resistance against the ongoing abolition of man. If we accept and assert a Tao of right and wrong, then we can indeed move beyond paralysis and cultivate hope for a potentially universal morality, even in this, our cynical age. And I want to add, briefly, what I'm calling my Christian coda. You may have noticed that this evening I've not been making an explicitly Christian argument. And I haven't talked about the importance for Christian doctrine and for the church of the things I've been mentioning. But let me end with this challenge. This is homework assignment, guys. Please reread Romans chapters 1 to 3. And ask this: in the absence of moral realism, what sense do those chapters make? What do they say to a culture, to a society, to youth, soaked in the philosophical materialism and naturalism that today dominate the public square and choke off both Christians and non-Christians' capacity to treat good and evil as more than biologically, culturally, or subjectively constructed entities? Imagine Romans 3:23 being rewritten in keeping with naturalism. For all have transgressed arbitrary and transitory culturally constructed norms and come short of the glory of God. If we ponder this question, and it has other implications, I think we'll understand better why an assertion of moral realism is necessary, at least for Christians. And I never assume that everybody in my audience is a Christian. If you're not, I'm speaking to you as well. Mutual repugnance cuts both ways. And if we accept moral relativism and reductionism and naturalism, then the child who says it's not fair is deeply deceived, because it's really arbitrary. I think we'll better understand, if we focus on this question, why an assertion of moral realism is necessary, and why it is truly what Lewis, in his bookish way, called a preparatio evangelica, a preparation for the gospel. Because without an assumption of moral realism, what is the gospel? Well, I think I know what the gospel is, at least in its outlines. And I'm also convinced that naturalism and relativism are not good news. Thank you very much. Now, I know from watching YouTubes of previous Weston lectures that there's a time for discussion afterwards. And I'm really happy to field my own questions, and if I miss somebody, you can just shout at me. But I think there are microphones here, so that for future YouTube watchers, they'll hear the question as well as the response to the question. While you're building up your courage to ask a question, I've been asked to give an advertisement. Paul Heinzman here? There he is at the back. Paul Heinzman is a sort of central processing unit for much that happens in the orbit of the University of Ottawa, and in connection with the graduate and faculty Christian fellowship at the University of Ottawa. He's got a little book discussion group going on the Tao of Right and Wrong, and he warmly invites you to join in that. So Paul, just wave at everybody again, please. If you're interested in that discussion group, Paul's your man. He's also involved with Arosha, and you probably can't read this. Oh, maybe you can. Small print. On Saturday, Janet, my wife, who's there sitting next to last year's Weston lecturer, Dominic Manganiello, a dear old-time colleague from the University of Ottawa. Anyway, Janet, my wife of just over 49 years, is giving a talk at Arosha on Saturday afternoon at 5 o'clock. I'm going to be playing a supporting role. Janet is a composer and has written a piece called 6 Pieces of a Reverberant Cosmos. in which she took 6 excerpts from an anthology I did back in the year 2000 called The Book of the Cosmos, Imagining the Universe from Heraclitus to Hawking. I've taken just little excerpts from what I call my pick of Western cosmology's greatest hits, and not set them to music. I won't be singing them. She's written compositions based on the theme. So we're going to do 2 of those movements. So I'll read 2 of these excerpts, and Janet will play recordings of the piece that she wrote. And we'll be discussing the relevance of cosmological understanding to the preservation and stewarding of the earth at Arosha. Anyway, you're warmly welcome. It's, I think it's in Paul's living room up near Kingsmere. And again, ask Paul about it. You'd be more than welcome to come and join in the conversation. Okay, questions about tonight's talk? I'd love to. Yes?
Just push the button on the top. This is on? Yes. Well, thanks for the talk. So, I agree that moral realism is something that we need to cover, but here's the thing. Within Christianity, metaphysics is something that you were kind of scared of.
Yeah.
Right? So you bring up metaphysics and everyone's like, oh, we can't talk about that because it's philosophy, and philosophy is going to mess up theology. So, when you say we want to retrieve moral realism,
Yeah.
are we talking Platonic, Aristotelian, Thomistic, and how do you teach kids realism? You can't teach your kids Platonic realism without trying to go, talking about the forms or something, right? So, like, what is it? What kind of realism are you talking about?
Okay.
And how do you get the next generation, I guess, like these guys, without, they must be reading Plato.
Sure. Well, there's nothing wrong with reading Plato and Aristotle. I encourage it, but it doesn't have to boil down to Plato and Aristotle or to metaphysics that speaks the name metaphysics. Of course, what I'm talking about, if I'm saying that we have to go beyond naturalism, beyond physis, beyond nature, then almost by definition, I'm going metaphysical on you, but not necessarily in the rarefied philosophical sense that it's often used. So yes, it's metaphysical. How do we get there? I think one of the places we can begin, part of Jesus' teaching was a sort of reflexive teaching. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You need to start where you live. How do I want to be treated? And extend that to others.
You wouldn't get realism from that, though, right?
Well, you get realism from it because
all you get is a sort of relativism which you want to reject and I want to reject. Because I could be living out in, somewhere in the jungle of India, and I'm like, okay, look, I can treat my neighbor the way I want to, and maybe I want to fight all the time, right? And so I go start a fight with him all the time. So I want to start a fight, and maybe I'm a feisty guy. So you can't. I don't know how you can get realism from treating someone that you want to be treated the same way.
Okay, well, I don't think I've met many human beings who don't want to be treated fairly, right? So that's it's not the only way to begin, but it's an empirical place to begin. It's an experiential place to begin. Once you get something that's subjectively true in one case and find that it's subjectively true in a million cases, a sociologist, an anthropologist is likely to say that it's actually not. It's not merely subjective. The subjectivity reflects a deeper reality. Nobody likes to be treated unfairly. So I'm just thinking in sort of practical, sort of kindergarten level ethics. If you don't like Johnny hitting you, don't hit him, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And in the appendix to Lewis's book and the slightly expanded appendix to mine, there are examples of ethical principles that run across cultures. And I'm not suggesting that they're real because they come from those cultures. I suspect, and again, it's not something that I can prove apodictically, that they're in all of those cultures because they're true, because there's something more radical, more rooted in what I've been calling the Tao than just, as it were, cultural whim. So I take your point that establishing metaphysical truth is a really hard thing to do, but in terms of practical ethics, practical morality, there are places to begin that are not highfalutin and don't require a bachelor's degree in philosophy. Well, thank you for your question. Andre.
Hello again.
Hi again.
Yeah, I'm fine. It's interesting that we started with a question like that, because like what we learn at school is straight up that the Christian theology and the Greco-Roman mindset that it is evolving are two separate things, and that the basic Christian roots in the Bible is capable of adapting the means of thought of others into itself. It's just that it's often associated with Europe because it was largely there.
Yes.
But the thing is, and that kind of brings me to my point, that that often we think of classical studies as Eurocentric, but you're using an Asian concept, the Tao. And I'm wondering, is there something about Asian philosophy that gives thought to Christian thought in a way that the Greco-Roman tradition that normally is used to help explain Christian theology in a philosophical way can't? So is there something to be gained? What insight does the Eastern way of just viewing life allow you to do in terms of bringing out the truths of Christ that you simply would not get from Aristotle, Plato?
Wonderful question. Yeah. Well, thanks, Andre. Well, first of all, I'm very far from being an expert in Eastern philosophy or Eastern religion, so I really can't pronounce on all of those things. I did a little bit of research on the concept of the Tao in putting this book together, and both Lewis and I recognize that we're borrowing something. Christians are great borrowers. And you gave examples of that. Greco-Roman culture, there are a lot of borrowings from that in the development of Christianity. You may know that the college's namesake, St. Augustine, wrote a work called De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine, and developed the concept of borrowing, maybe even more than borrowing. He has the concept that's known as Egyptian gold. He looks at the story of the Exodus and says, God gave the children of Israel permission to take valuable things from Egypt with them when they fled Egypt. And so he uses this as a metaphor of Christians' penchant for, I'm using a polite term, borrowing the good things, the true gold that they find in other cultures, and turning it to God's worship. Of course, other critics have said, you know what they did with that gold? They turned it into a golden calf and made it an object of worship. That's a cautionary tale. But the principle of Egyptian gold, I think, is a sound one. Christianity historically has been eclectic. And so what I've done tonight in this little book is also eclectic. I've borrowed the concept of the Tao, and you can find analogous, if you read the book, there are analogous concepts in Hinduism, in Buddhism, that kind of help us understand a sort of something that's down there, something that's radical, something that's in the root of reality, that's more than just physics, and is therefore, forgive me, metaphysical. So yeah, eclecticism, let's go for it.
Yeah, that doesn't quite get to the heart of my question. What did you gain from using the Eastern approach, to whatever extent you are, that you would not have been doing the more traditional Greco-Roman routes? What new thing did you learn? What new goal?
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. As you may know, Tao means way, means it's a road, it's a path. And so for me, I'll just answer that subjectively. What did I get from it? For me, I've been using a kind of static analogy that the Tao is a bedrock. It's a root. It's something that grounds me. But because its meaning is the road, it also has a dynamic dimension. I believe that there are new things that we can learn from the Tao. This is not an ossified set of principles that's there and has been fully exploited. So in the book I give the example of the equality of the sexes, the abolition of slavery. There are things that are actually culturally, historically quite new, but I would say are outgrowths from the Tao. So it gives me a way of talking about change, because of course our ideas of what are right and wrong might undergo certain kinds of change, even in certain kinds of improvement, without positing that the Tao itself is a matter of something that's just a series of vicissitudes. Yeah, thanks, Andre. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Hi there. I took note when you mentioned the Romans 3 reference that you made about the inability without this foundation of moral absolute to even come to grips with the language of Scripture and the language of what the Christian message as a whole is.
Yeah.
As you said, there are some we'll be watching on YouTube. Supposing you were addressing someone, a concerned clergy or layman in a church who recognizes, okay, there is a gap between what is being said and what is being heard, what advice would you give to a church to try to bridge that or to acknowledge that and adjust so that they are addressing and speaking in a way that can be culturally understood today in an environment that isn't anchored in absolutes?
Okay, it's a wonderful and extremely difficult question. I don't make a business of. Well, I mean, as a parent, I've given out lots of advice, and it hasn't always been appreciated. But let me try. I went to a church service 2 weeks ago in Waco, Texas, in which we spent a long time reading the law. Some of you may have been in churches where the Ten Commandments are recited, if not weekly, regularly. And it did strike me at a superficial level that these weren't terribly seeker-friendly. Right? And so I'm not really being facetious. I think often, and this is not a rebuke in any sense, it's a wonderful question, that the effort to be seeker-friendly, in the effort to be seeker-friendly, we often put under wraps the true attraction of the gospel and of the scriptures. People don't, just again superficially, we don't really like hearing 4 scripture passages read in a single 1-hour church service, so we cut it back to 3 or 2 or 1, or maybe just have 1 or 2 verses. We're sort of averse to being taught, frankly. So I think my advice to the clergy you sketch would be bold and risk irrelevance if it displays your allegiance to the truth. And again, I understand that it's a fine line between dogma and dogmatism. Dogma has a bad name, but dogma is teaching. Karl Barth's church dogmatics is church teaching, is doctrine. And we're sort of afraid of our own doctrinal shadows, as it were. So, I don't want to be a curmudgeon about this. But I think, seeker-friendly can simply be an abandonment of the Tao. There are ways of doing it better than I'm doing it right now to make, and we need examples. How are the Ten Commandments, for example, relevant to our life today? They're not important because they're relevant. Let's be clear about that. They're important because they're the Ten Commandments. But how are they relevant to our lives today? That takes a lot of working out. Try having a discussion about the Sabbath, for example, and you'll find lots of different views, and that you won't find resolution. But at least let's have the discussion and treat these documents as serious and authoritative, and not worry too much that it's going to come across as being authoritarian. Another fine distinction. So thanks for the question.
Thanks very much for your talk.
Thank you.
This idea of the Tao, it seems to be a concept that C.S. Lewis used to refer sort of cross-culturally.
Yes.
It's something that appears across broad different cultures, different religions, and all that.
Yes.
And but what is it really? Where does it come from really? And I thought that maybe you were touching on it when you referred to Jesus giving the golden rule.
Mm-hmm.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's
Yes.
kind of like the reason this is happening across cultures is because everybody feels the same.
Yes.
And that perhaps where this is coming from is from our emotions. That's where it all comes from. So if you ask anybody anywhere how they feel when something they consider immoral is done to them,
Yes.
they will always give you a negative emotional response.
Yes.
And whenever you ask them how they feel when something moral is done to them, something upright, they give you a positive emotional
Yes.
response.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if that's what Jesus is getting at when he says, as you would.
Yeah. Yeah.
Them do to you. What are your thoughts on
I'm going to be completely equivocal here and agree and disagree. I agree that the emotional response, I don't like it when people treat me unfairly, is a valid response, and it is emotional. It has an emotional dimension. I think it's got a more than emotional foundation. I think that the emotional response points to something beyond itself. If you're just looking at the epiphenomenon of an emotion and grounding morality in that, I think we're in trouble if we treat it as emotivism or subjectivism. So I think you've put your finger on a very important insight, that there's something universal about that, but it's not just a sort of polling of individual emotional responses. Those individual emotional responses point to something deeper, which we can posit as, we can give it different names if you like, but that we can posit as the Tao, something that is a kind of bedrock. And of course, as a Christian theist, I see that as profoundly connected to God and not separate from him. I see it as divine. But I think to open up the conversation in our pluralistic society, a word like the Tao is useful just because some people are allergic to a more explicitly biblical language. But I'm not abandoning biblical language, as I indicated in the last paragraph of the talk. So thanks for drawing that out. It gives me an opportunity to say yes, but not just that. Thank you.
I'm wondering what Lewis would say, and then through you, what you think of the new morality that is being very shrilly proclaimed in the public square. Say the whole transgender morality.
Yep.
And there's a pastor's wife in Britain who's going to be hauled before the police for misgendering some person's daughter or son or whatever permutation that person has come to.
Yeah.
And there is a very, very clear sense of right and wrong in the people that are shouting this.
Yeah.
Also about women's right to abortion, and that people who are talking about pro-life and what abortion really is, they are creating an unsafe space for women in university campuses. So can you talk a bit about this kind of reverse morality that's happening that is very emotional and very totalitarian?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, those are areas that I just wanted to avoid entirely, and now you've put me on the spot. I think there's a lot of damage that's being done. I read yesterday or the day before that there was a rape crisis center in Vancouver that is being defunded by the city because it will only accept victims of rape who were born female, which excludes transgender, self-identified females who weren't born female. And so the city of Vancouver is defunding them. To my mind, this is complete madness. And those who are sort of true feminists, I'm not sure why they're not more up in arms about this. Partly, perhaps, because like me, they're afraid what might happen. Let me talk. You used the term rights, and I talk a little bit about this in my third chapter. And I had a little bit of email correspondence with Margaret Somerville about this, who's a true and very fine ethicist. I'm just sticking my big toe in the waters. And she encouraged me not to be too negative about human rights. I think the vocabulary of human rights is a place for us to engage in dialogue. So where do rights come from? Well, I in my naive way, I think human rights come from the Tao. They don't just come from, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the UN, but that's a useful document. It's worth getting out and reading because Ontario human rights law finds its anchor in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's a vocabulary that people understand, even though they seem to have no clue about where rights come from. Still, it's a basis for discussion out there in the public square. So if you're talking about the right to life or the right to abortion, are these two equal and opposite rights? Everyone needs to be challenged to say, where does the right come from? I mean, the very notion of right is, from the Tao of right and wrong, not my title, but the actual thing. So it's a place to have a conversation, and if we can be non-hostile and keep our voices down, maybe there's some grounds for optimism that we can have that dialogue and make some, I would hope, moral progress. I'm not hugely optimistic just from looking around and giving, with the examples that you've mentioned and the example I gave. So I'm disappointed in the answer I'm giving you because I'm not quite sure. But thank you for putting me in an awkward spot.
Oh, there's another question. Sorry, you don't get off yet.
Gregory. Oh, and over. Yeah, go ahead.
First, just to say, I really like the resonance with the original Abolition of Man in your text here. And I'm going to ask a first question, a harder one, and then come around to a question at the end. And I mean it as a pondering rather than as a challenge in asking the question. So the first question is, do we need always to have another ideology to oppose the ideologies that we reject? The term ideology didn't come up, I think, but there were a lot of terms that had isms in them. So you started by saying subjectivism and relativism and naturalism. Then we had scientism, we had nihilism, we had materialism. We had dogmatism came up and emotivism. judgmentalism, and even moralism came up.
Yeah.
Now, the alternative to subjectivism would be objectivism. The alternative to relativism would be absolutism. So,
or just realism.
Or something else,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So more realism you were promoting as a philosophy
Yes.
of some kind.
Yes.
C.S. Lewis accepted the natural science of evolution, or at least a limited biology of evolution, but he was very specific to reject ideological evolutionism
Yes.
or philosophical philosophical evolutionism. So the question at the backside is, how do we rescue science from turning into ideology? So you mentioned naturalistic science. And then maybe on the more constructive side, can we reverse this evolution of man by more science, philosophy, and theology discourse that doesn't collapse into this clash of ideologies?
Yes. Okay. Well, thanks for that, Gregory. It's a wonderful list that you made of all the isms, most of which I'm opposing and one of which I'm not, moral realism.
And not to forget altruism.
Altruism. Okay, good. It's slightly different. Some of the isms are ideology. Altruism is a set of behaviors. I guess when you're mad about something, you like to tack ism on the end of the thing that you're attacking. Can we do without the term moral realism, I'm wondering? How about just morality? Okay. But morality that is treated, that we treat as something that's just real. The morally real. And so in a way I'm arguing, and I'm just a little guy in Lewis's shadow in this regard. Let's treat morality as real and not just something that's made up or constructed. There's a lovely postmodern term, isn't it? That's constructed, that's made up. So let's, we don't have to go all and I'm not really going all ideological on you. But let's recognize the ideology when we see it. Let's recognize a scientist who's talking scientifically and a scientist who's talking ideologically. And an example I gave, Carol is speaking ideologically. He's not making a claim about specific science. He's taking his methodology and saying this is all there is. And he's insulting and bad-mouthing people, human beings, who believe in something beyond the here and now, something beyond mere empirical knowledge and so on. So there's a kind of, I don't just want to answer insult with an insult, but I want to say, okay, let's just stop. What is at the basis of what you're teaching, Harari or Carroll or Weinberg, for whom I have huge respect as a scientist? So maybe we can be non-ideological. I don't think Romans 1-3 is ideological. It's theological. It's anthropological. I would want to start with Scripture and draw inferences from that, but not get so bound up in the drawing of inferences that our faith is in an ideology. My faith is in God, not in an ideology, not even in a theology. I'm only going part way with your question, and it's definitely food for thought. Okay, thank you. Okay. Was there one other? Okay. Oh, yes, ma'am. This will be the last question. I'll be available if anyone wants to come and chat. Yes.
So the gentleman that asked about the clergy question.
Yes.
So this is not my discipline, and I'm just like an active listener, so I'm going to try and be as articulate as possible. How does this then take shape in a society where separation of church and state exists, right? And so for one thing, the response you can give back to the clergy is, be this way, act this way, consider these things.
Yes.
But in a posture, I'm maybe going to use the political landscape.
Okay.
Right, and so what does that look like or sound like, and I don't mean like as in I need you to say these things, but I guess the tension of holding, right, these core values and wanting to express what you talked about,
yes.
but also being in a system
yes, yes.
that to do that is ignorant or at times even harmful. I just wondered if you could.
So what was harmful?
The posture that you could take.
The posture, yes.
In seeking to bring voice to what we've talked about today.
That's a really helpful question. I'll try to respond to it briefly. Let me start with the separation of church and state, which is a fundamentally American idea. It's often tossed around as a reason for keeping religion out of the public square. In fact, it was originally in the U.S. A way of keeping government out of the churches, right? So that there's no state religion in the U.S. There was a separation of church and state. But be that as it may, I'm not an expert in that history. I would just warn against treating separation of church and state to imply a separation of public life and religion. Yeah. Because you can't, I think you can't be a religious person and utterly private about it. Religion and faith tend to be treated as private matters. Well, that's just your opinion, right? That you just, keep it to yourself. You can be, flaming this, that, or something else politically or culturally. That's fine. But if you're this, that, or if you're a Christian, you just stay out of it. Just anecdotally, I had at UBC an atheist lesbian colleague whom I'm full of admiration for, who did me the favor once of coming and saying to me, "Dennis, I recognize that you're an out Christian." I love that adjective. Because on the university campus, for example, you can be an out, you name it. And that kind of gave me permission to be an out Christian. It's okay to be out, whatever it happens to be. So that meant that I didn't have to go and hide in a box somewhere. And so I think there's an element of boldness that's required, a refusal to be shut up or shut out. I heard the story last night of somebody who was wanting to assign a textbook that was authored by Owen Gingerich, who's a professor emeritus of astronomy, one of the world's leading historians of astronomy, who's an out Christian. And the colleague of this person who was telling the story yesterday said, "Oh, well, he's a Christian. That shouldn't be on the reading list." I mean, it's all right to be a raving Marxist atheist on the reading list, but if you're a Christian, then... So I would simply say, no, let's accept the premise of pluralism. You've got the raving Marxist atheist, that's fine. You've got my friend Owen Gingerich, who's an out Christian. It should all be fair game. And there we're appealing to a concept of fairness, right? We're actually appealing to the Tao in doing that. So it's never easy, and it's not going to get easy. But let me give you one other little anecdote that I rather enjoyed. Christians are pretty much a frightened bunch, and Christian students even more frightened, for good reason. When I've talked to Christian groups on campus, I've always said, look, if you're a Christian, yeah, be afraid, be very afraid, but if you have an opportunity in front of your professors or in front of fellow students, at least find some way of running the flag up the flagpole. I mean, the day after Ash Wednesday, I walked into the supermarket, and I still had the imposition of ashes on my forehead. I'd never done this before. I'm not a liturgical guy, but I'm trying to learn a bit about Anglicanism. So I had the imposition of ashes. I had this smudgy black cross on my forehead. And the cashier said, what is that? So I said, well, I was actually at a Ash Wednesday service last night, and it's called the imposition of ashes. They actually get smeared on the forehead, and it's the beginning of the pilgrimage toward Easter, and it's a period of reflection and repentance. She said, oh, I'm so glad to know that, because I saw somebody on TV who also had that on their forehead, and I wondered what it was. And you see what that did was, it was a little running of the flag up the flagpole, contrary to any intention that I had. I'd forgotten it was there. Some people look at themselves in the mirror in the morning. I don't even do that. But it meant that this person was now aware that there was somebody on CNN and somebody who'd gone through the checkout line at Thrifty's who had something in common. Christians are out there. And that's good for people to know. Just a little anecdote. But thanks for your question. Okay.
Well, please say thank you if you use the word.
Thank you.